Welcome back for week 5 of our missional practices study, Shaped by God's Heart. This week, we are on missional practice number 4, right? Missional principle number 4. And it is this: rewrite worship every week. Now, let me give you a little bit of an introduction to today's lesson. Now, many of you watch the news. Some of you may even still get the newspaper. Now, I'm from a generation that has never once gotten a newspaper in their mailbox, right? However, many of you are still newspaper people. Many of you are still watching the news. And you might even have a favorite section in the right, and you know where to get it. You know what time to tune in because it's the same every week. But what if the news, right? Think about this. What if the news was the same every single week? Not what was where in the segment, but the actual news. What if the news never changed every single week? Would you still tune in? Would you still have a subscription to your local newspaper? Probably not, right? Because we enjoy the news and we continue to take it in because the form is consistent. We know what to count on as far as what's coming to us, but the content is different and it changes. And the same is true in the missional churches. Missional churches do not deliver the same experience every single time they gather, right? How many churches, on the flip side of this, have you been to that simply go through the motions in worship, right? Well, we know we're going to do this, and we know we're going to do this, and we know we're going to do this. But at the end of the day, there hasn't been like a life-transforming experience of God. The content has been the exact same from week to week. Meanwhile, worship is meant to be this encounter with God. It's meant to encounter God so deeply that it impacts us in our daily lives, right? Menatra says this. He says, "Can one hold fire and not be burned? Hardly. Neither can the worshiper encounter God without being changed." Right? So there's a constant sense of renewal that is happening, right? So when we talk about rewriting worship every week, what we mean is that we're crafting an experience with God each Sunday, each Wednesday, each day of the week, whatever day it is you're meeting. We're crafting these experiences that lift us up to even better worship of God, even greater worship, even more creative worship. Right? So when we talk about rewriting worship, that's really what we're saying. We're saying that the content has to be different each week. It has to be fresh and new and refreshing for people so that we can experience the goodness of God. We can experience the Spirit of God at work in our lives. So what does that look like? Well, let's jump into a few of our topics here this week. The first is this: God is the focus of worship, right? In missional churches, God is the focus of worship. Now, what I mean by that is this: worship is designed to exalt God, right? Now, this may seem like a really elementary thing. You're like, well, of course it does, right? Except that too often in our churches, worship is not about God, it's about us, right? Worship is about entertaining us. Now, I usually hear this complaint about worship being too entertaining and too much like a show. I usually hear it from the traditional side of the traditional versus contemporary debate. I get it from the traditional side, and they say, well, all the contemporary stuff is just a show, right? Except the traditional services that I've been in are just as much a show, right? There's a choir that sings the song for you. There are ensembles and orchestras that play the music for you, right? You are very rarely participating in worship. So this is not just a contemporary church problem, right? This is a universal. Everybody struggles with this, right? Because it goes both ways. Worship is often about us and not about God. And so these worship experiences with the Lord always sort of include an air of what we'll call the mysterious, right? It's worship that you can't quite put your finger on, right? It's the reason we enjoy the things that we're doing in our worship services. It's the reason we enjoy the choirs and the praise teams and the prayer times, right? We enjoy them because there's something about them that we can't quite explain, right? I cannot explain to you why when I pray, my eyes constantly water, right? I can't explain to you why when I'm singing, I feel like I've left the building and it's just me and Jesus in a room together, right? There's this air of the mysterious when you get into an experience with God. And so this is not always like what we used to call seeker sensitive, right? Where we have to do away with anything that relates to church or Jesus, right? We have to basically dumb down Christianity. That is not what we have to do here. What we have to do is worship God. Make sure that God is the focus of what we're doing, because it's not us that people want to experience, right? It's not us that new people come to church to experience. They come because they want an experience with the living God. And so the book says this: worship is not intended to reach the unreached, but to allow those who know God to bring him praise. And this is what draws others to God, right? An experience of God in worship. An experience of God in the service with other people. And so there's always this sort of tension in worship, right? Because we know that God is near, right? It's that God is with us in that moment. But there's also this thought that God is out there, right? That God is he's both near, but yet not too familiar, right? He's always got that air of the mysterious. And missional churches are okay with living in that tension, right? We don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to come up with every answer to every question. Because we're worshiping a God who is both with us and beyond us, right? If you can get through a worship experience and be able to explain logically every single thing that happened, we have to question whether or not we really experience God. Because God is, at some level, beyond us. He's more than just us. He's more than what we can experience, more than what we can comprehend, right? There's so much to him. Remember, the bigger box. That's what we need, the big box. And so, regardless of the size of the congregation, or regardless of how we worship, or the form in which we worship, there's always an audience, and that audience in worship is one, right? We call it an audience of one. Because worship is the experience of God's people entering his presence for his benefit, right? Worship is not about us. Worship is about God. He's the only one that matters when we worship. We should be able to lose ourselves in a worship service because we're so focused on Jesus, we're so focused on God, that we don't even notice anything else around us. So worship, God is the focus of worship. But worship for us, as the people who are in it, worship should be experiential, right? And remember, we call it a worship service. Have you ever thought about this? Why do we call it a worship service? Well, what a service means, right? It means we're doing something. We're participating in something, right? So why would we call it a worship service? Why would we call it a worship service when we're not at all engaged in it, right? And it's funny because research says that human beings prefer engaging in experiences rather than just passively receiving things, right? So everywhere else in the world, we know for a fact that people prefer to be a part of something and to be actively engaged instead of just something being given to them, right? It's why when you go to concerts, they always tell you to, sing louder or to lift your hands or do whatever it is they're asking you to do, right? They want you to dance, right? Participation is what engages us, right? And so worship should be an experiential part of our lives. And yet, many of these services, right, do not actually engage people, right? We sit in the pew. We watch the people on stage, whether that's the choir or the praise team or the pastor or the liturgist, right? We're watching other people engage in worship. This is what makes our worship services more entertainment than active worship. And so authentic worship, right? Authentic worship at missional churches, it invites participants and not spectators, right? We're not just there to watch. Worship is about encountering God and hearing God and entering God's presence, right? These are active things that we are seeking. Those things don't happen without us being actively engaged. Worship is experiential and participative. And one of the ways in worship services where we're often invited to participate is through our prayer, right? Because prayer is one of the most powerful ways that we experience God. I often say that prayer is our act of getting out of God's way, right? We're giving the control to God. We're giving all of our faith, all of our love to Jesus when we say, look, God, here's what's on my heart. And so if you think about it, the mission of God, remember we talked in week 1 about the Missio Dei, right? The mission of God to reach the world, that is an overwhelming mission, right? There is no possible way we could fulfill that on our own. unless we are active in prayer. And so missional churches are prayer-based congregations, right? How do you experience God? If you're going to make worship experiential, you get people praying, right? Because what better way to see Jesus at work than when we pray? So how we do this varies, and churches find different ways to do it. You've got churches who use like prayer rooms where people can come and pray in a specific space. They've got needs posted on the wall, all kinds of cool stuff like that. You've got prayer teams on Sunday mornings, right? Groups of two people who pair up and they stand up front and they say, all right, this is our prayer time. Come and get prayed for, right? You have prayer teams. You've got prayer groups that meet throughout the week. There's 100 different ways you can do this, right? Corporate prayer together is what matters, right? We're praying together for the needs of our church, for the needs of our community, for the mission of God, right? Prayer is our number one priority, okay? Any church that is going to make good strides, positive strides to the kingdom, has started in prayer. So when we talk about experiential worship, we got to start with prayer. Prayer as an act of worship. Prayer not just as a formality, but as a vital dialogue with a living God. Prayer is key. However, worship is also about our content and not just our form. And I hope you're picking up on this, right? Because we have these battles that rage between worship styles, right? Specifically talking about music. But do they really need to, right? Do we really need these battles to be won? If we are focusing on worshiping Jesus and not just my preference, would there be worship battles? I don't think so. I think worship battles are based in an egocentric church. It's how does my church fulfill me? These battles rage because we think worship is about us and what we want and what we need and our desires and our fulfillment. And spoiler alert, it isn't, right? What was the very first point we talked about today? Worship is about God, right? Worship is about God. And so God has long time accepted various expressions of worship as long as those are involved are focused on Him, right? You think of, if you want to get real traditional in our worship, right? Traditional worship in Scripture was sacrificing animals on an altar. Would you like to go back to that? I don't think so. But we also have like the monastic era, in the chants, we have hymns, we have contemporary music. All of it worships God, right? I can't tell you how upset I get when people try to say that one style, this style is, and this style is. No, stop, right? This is nonsense, okay? Worship is anything that engages people to give praise and honor to God, okay? Just because it isn't your style music, right? I love rock music personally, right? But it's not for everybody. I know that, right? That doesn't mean I'm going to go around and yell at everybody else because they listen to country, right? That's not how this works. Why do we do it in the church, right? Why do we have these arguments in the church? And because worship should be more about content, right? We're not concerned with one style or another. We just use them all, right? We're going to do whatever we can to give worship to God. Because the God that I know is worthy of being worshipped, right? That's why worship sometimes is referred to as worthship, right? God is worthy of our worship. Who cares what it looks like, right? If we are doing it and our heart is in it, it is worship, right? So what happens when we get it wrong, right? When do we get it wrong? Well, on the traditional side, what we get wrong is that tradition can often be preserved long beyond its relevance, okay? And in the book, he tells this story about a Japanese restaurant in Tokyo that would constantly put out little piles of salt on the street out back. And this was recently, right? So when they asked, well, why do they do that? Well, it comes from way back in history when people would bring their cows through town, right? The cows were coming in with them. So the cow would stop to lick up the salt, and the person could size up the restaurant while their cow is sitting there with the salt, right? Obviously, people don't ride around with cows anymore. But the tradition still lasted, and they still put salt on the street, right? But nobody knew why. Nobody could tell you why they did that anymore. And how many things in our churches have no reason anymore? We do them simply because we've always done them, not because they actually accomplish the worship of God. Now, on the flip side, just because if tradition is not necessarily bad, right? Because it isn't, right? Tradition is good if we know why we're doing it and it still holds meaning. Well, innovation isn't good just for innovation's sake, right? And C.S. Lewis, he said this. He said, the perfect church service would be one where we were almost unaware of. Our attention would have been on God, right? And so what he's getting at is that people need to be able to keep up, right? Worship service, we should be able to lose ourselves in the worship, right? To be able to close our eyes. We know the words. We know the beat. We know, right? We get into it because we don't have to constantly be struggling to follow and keep up. Now, this is where I think most of the worship wars come from, right? Because you have the new generation who doesn't know the hymns, and they don't really care to know them. And so they can't keep up in the traditional service. And in the traditional service, folks, they don't keep up with the new stuff because they're so used to what they've known in church, right? So really what it comes down to is what area are we getting lost in, right? And so people need to be able to keep up, which churches do really well. Some churches will post their set lists online beforehand. They'll create a playlist sometimes for any new music, or they'll say, hey, look, this Sunday, here's our playlist, so people can go and listen to the music even before church. So that when they get there, they're able to know the music and know what's coming, and they can just get lost in worship. And so churches like Mosaic, they offer a variety of worship styles even within one service, right? They don't feel tied to one area or another simply because of what hour it is, right? And so they have multiple services still at play, but with very different feels, right? And so because of this, everybody has some way that they get to experience God. And so he says that rewriting worship every week breathes new life into the old and creates sacred space for the new. And so we really have to ask ourselves, is this our approach to worship, right? Is this how we're approaching our worship? Not just as a church, but as individuals, right? Are we breathing new life into the old while also making sacred space for the new? Now, worship is also highly participatory. A great word, isn't it? Participatory. Worship, too often, is consumer-oriented, right? We've kind of mentioned that already. And so inclusion of members in the act of worship is what we're talking about, making that a critical and vital piece of what we do. And that happens not just through the singing, right, but throughout all of it, right? Are we including our folks? Are we expecting folks to participate in the planning, the preparing, and the expressing of our worship? And it's not just during the worship hour. When we think of worship, we think specifically of music, right? But worship is anything that we do to give glory and honor to God. So you're talking about things like greeters and guides and ushers, right? They are worshiping in their act of service. So are our greeters and our guides and our ushers, what are we doing to help prepare them and equip them to be worshipful in the way that they are serving? It comes down to writing dramatic presentations, prepping multimedia presentations, sermon notes, devotionals, you name it, serving communion, prayer teams, right? These are all ways that we worship God. And yet, is this how we portray it? Or when we talk about worship, do we just talk about music? Worship is more than just music, guys. It's more than just music. Worship is anything that we are doing, right? Which is why worship is highly participatory, because you don't have to be musical or artistic to participate in worship. There is so much we can do to worship God with our words and with our actions and with our serving. So because of this, worship values creativity. And we often think of creativity in worship as music, or maybe it's dynamic preaching, right? These are things that we normally think of when we think of creativity in worship. But what about all the other elements of the church, right? God is creative, right? Literally, this is the first thing we believe as Christians, right? Genesis chapter 1, God created all things, right? God is creative in a very literal sense. And then he makes us in his image, in his creative image, and he gives each of us these gifts and these skills to be creative. And I love this quote from Erwin McManus. He says this. He says, not everyone can paint or sculpt or dance, but everyone is creative. Most people say, oh, I'm not creative. What they mean is they are not artistic. What we have to help them realize is that creativity spans the whole human experience. You can be creative through mercy or through administration, or creative through giving or teaching. So what that means is that creativity manifests itself in every area of our lives. You can be creative with your tech skills. You can be creative in interior design, right? Setting up a space that makes people feel welcome and invited. You can be creative in music. You can be creative in songwriting, in dance, painting, or sketching, right? I don't know if you've never been in a service where somebody is painting during service and it comes out as this beautiful, oh my goodness, right? You can be creative in your writing, right? You can be creative in leading a giving campaign and encouraging generosity. You can be creative in your gardening, right? These are all areas where God has given us creativity in which we can use to worship him. Because worship is everything done to give praise and glory to God. So it should be as wide and as creative as the glory of God. Okay? Think about that, right? How wide and big and huge is the glory of God? Is God big, right? Because we all think he is. We all say he is. Then why isn't our worship of God big? Why isn't it extravagant and over the top and just giving full everything every single time we worship him? So really what we're getting at is this. Worship is more than words. Worship is more than words. And maybe this is really what we're getting at with this entire week here. Worship is so much more than just the words that we speak on Sunday morning or the words that we sing on Sunday morning. Our worship is often full of noise, right? Whether it's instruments or singing or preaching or praying, it's always things we're doing out loud. But worship is more than just our words. In fact, we might ask, where's the role of silence in our worship? Right? Jesus often withdrew to be alone and to be in quiet. Where's our silence? Right? It's more than just words. And Michael Rydell says this: I have gradually been moving towards the conclusion that our words are getting in the way of the gospel, that the church is somehow imprisoned in a kind of cognitive captivity which is inhibiting our mission, maybe even keeping Christ on the fringes. Right? In other words, we sing it and we say it, and yet our worship of God has to be lived, right? It's in the way that we live our lives. Worship is more than just our words. This is what it means, guys, to be in worship, to live a worshipful life, okay? This is what it means. So, let me leave you with some questions to consider this week, as we do each week. Number one, I want you to reflect on the most meaningful worship experience that you can remember. Which components resulted in a profound impact upon you? Okay, so think about it. Was it music? Was it preaching? Was it a skit? Was it a painting? What was it? What was it about that service? Right. So reflect on the most meaningful worship experience, and then answer which components resulted in a profound impact upon you. Number two, how does your church prepare you and your family for personal worship? Right, a lifestyle of worship. What could you do to enhance this preparation? Okay, so in other words, how does your church prepare you to worship on a daily basis? And what can you do to help? What can you do to enhance this? And then finally, I want you to think about this. How would you finish these statements? Sometimes I wish worship would include ... If I were asked to lead in worship, I would offer to ... And finally, if I could change something about our worship experience, I would ... Okay? So those are the questions I want you to consider this week. Okay? I want you to consider them, and I want you to really consider them this week. How am I living a lifestyle of worship? Right? What does my worship of God look like? How am I participating? Is my church participating? Inviting me to participate, right? A lot of good questions this week. So focus on the three I gave you. Have great discussions on the rest of them, and I'll see you guys next week. Love you.